Hello and welcome to this lecture, and in this lecture what we will do is that we will learn about the relative layout, which is a layout which is quite different from the linear layout studied in the previous lecture. So as the name signifies, a relative layout is a layout in which elements are placed relative to each other. Now in order to learn the linear layout, let's first clean up the code from the previous lecture. And also let's change the linear layout to a relative layout. And as you could see, now we have relative layout in place. So let's first go ahead and understand relative layout by just adding elements on the layout. So let's first add up a button over here, and let's say the layout width is wrap content and height is wrap content as well. And what you need to do now is that you need to, let's say, give it some text. So let's say this is going to be button 1. So as I mentioned, in a relative layout, the elements are placed relative to each other. So for example, when you want to add another button to this particular layout, you have to place it in a relative position to this particular previous button, or you have to basically place it in relation to the relative layout. So let's say you want to add up a button right to the bottom of this particular button. So let's go ahead and add a button. So we'll type button, the layout width is going to be wrap content, height is going to be wrap content, and let's say the name of this button is going to be let's say button 2. So we'll type in button 2, and now as you could notice that the two buttons are overlapped onto each other. Now what you want to do is that you want to place the second button right to the bottom of the first button. So in order to do that, you have to use a property which is called as the layout below property. So essentially what you need to do is that via XML code, you need to specify that you want to place the button 2 right below the button 1. So in order to do that, the first thing which you need to do is that you need to have an ID to the button 1, so that you could specify through code that you need to place button 2 below the button which has the particular ID. So we specify ID over here for the button 1, and let's say the button 1's ID is BU1. So once we have this ID, we could use the property which is called as layout below. So we type Android layout below, and we will set it equal to @ID, and we want to set it below to the button 1. So we specify BU1 over here. And as you could see, as soon as we add the BU1 ID over here in button 2, the button 2 actually placed right below to the first button, which is button 1. Now let's say you want to place the third button to the right of the button 2. So in order to do that, you specify another button, which is, let's say, button 2. So we type in the button tag over here, set the width and height, set the text equals to, let's say, button 3. And what you need to do now is that you do need to assign an ID to button 2, because we want to place the button 3 relative to button 2. So we specify an ID for this, and let's say that is going to be BU2. And now to basically place button 3 to the right of the button 2, we type in Android layout to right of, and we want to place this to right of the button whose ID is BU2. So when you do that, it actually gets aligned to the right of the button 2. Now even though it's not exactly to the side of the button 2, but you could notice that it's actually to the right side of button 2. And if you have to bring it down over here, what you could do is that you could add another attribute by typing Android layout below, and you could type this equal to @ID BU1. So now the button 3 is actually to the right of button 2, and it's actually below button 1. So using these properties, which is the layout to right of, layout below, layout above, or to the layout to left of, you could basically go ahead and keep on adding elements to your layout and place it relative to each other. So this is how the relative layout works, and the main advantage of using relative layout is that dragging and dropping the elements on the layout becomes much more easier. So what you need to do is that you simply need to drag any element, and as you could see, as you keep on dragging these things, you could see the two arrows over here, which basically specifies that how a particular element is placed in relation to each other. Now one more thing which I would like to specify over here is that if you go to the XML code over here And let's say you want to have a gap in between these two elements. So as you could see now, the button 1 and button 2 do not have any gap. So let's say you want to fix that. So what you could do is that you could simply go ahead and use a property which is called as margin. So what you need to do is that, let's say you want to leave some margin to the top of the button 2. So you could go in button 2 and you could type in the property which is Android layout margin top, and you could specify the margin as, let's say, 30 dp. And as you could see, now you will have a space equivalent to 30 dps in between these two elements. So that's it for this lecture, and this was a brief overview of how a relative layout could be used to design your user interface. So remember, you need to use relative layout whenever you need to place elements in your user interface in relation to each other. So that's it for this lecture, and I hope you guys were able to understand how to design a relative layout. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.